All right, hi guys. Sorry I can't be there in person today, but I wanted to make sure you had a video of these notes since we're going through proofs. It helps a lot to kind of hear me talk through them as we do them. So I'm just going to do a couple short ones today, and really all we're doing is adding on to what we did yesterday. So first of all, back in our first notes, we talked about this abbreviation, the CPCTC, and we want to remember what that stands for. So CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so that is your C, P, C, T, and C, right? Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And basically, remember, that means that if I know that two triangles are congruent, that means that all 6 of their corresponding parts are also congruent. So all of their sides and all of their angles. We're going to use this in our proofs today to just take it 1 step or 2 steps farther than what we did in our notes on the last proofs. Okay, so let's try an example here and see how it goes. So we do our same basic setup, create our t-chart here for our statements and our reasons. And we always start with our givens. So we've got PR, or segment PR, is congruent to segment SR. And also segment PQ is congruent to segment SQ. And those are just given. Okay, so notice that what we're trying to prove this time is that angle P is congruent to angle S. I'm not just trying to prove that the two triangles are congruent. But if I want to prove angle P and angle S, well, those are corresponding parts of these two triangles that are shown here, right? So basically what I need to realize is that if I can prove those two triangles congruent, then that has to mean that angle P and angle S are congruent because they're corresponding parts. Okay, so I'm going to start the same way as we did before. I'm going to mark up my picture as much as I can. So my two givens tell me that PR is congruent to SR, and also PQ is congruent to SQ. So there's 2 of my parts. I want my third piece. Well, if I'm looking at my picture, I have that common side in the middle. So QR goes on both triangles, so it's congruent to itself. And now I've got 3 sides marked, so I'm going to use side, side, side to show that my 2 triangles are congruent. Well, I've already in my proof got 2 of my sides here from my givens. So there's one side. Here's my second side. To get my third side, I'm going to do another statement, and that's that one that they share that's a common side. So I can show that QR is congruent to QR. And remember, anytime we say something's congruent to itself, that is our reflexive property. Okay, there's our third side. So now that I've got my 3 sides, I'm going to say that the 2 triangles are congruent. And this is the part where you have to be careful, because when you write the names of your 2 triangles, you have to match up their corresponding parts. So the first triangle I can name in any way that I want. So I'm going to go with triangle PQR. And when I go to name my other triangle, I want to make sure that I say that in the same corresponding way. So if I started over here at P and then went along the side up to Q, then I want to start over here at S and go along this side up to Q. I noticed those sides both have 2 marks. Then I went down the side with 3 marks, so I'm going to go down the side with 3 marks. So triangle PQR has to be congruent to triangle SQR, right? So that's kind of the new part here. In the other proofs we did the other day, they had the triangles already marked there and what we were trying to prove. When you have to write those on your own, you've got to make sure you match up those corresponding parts. Okay, so then our reason there we said is going to be side, side, side. So now I've got 2 congruent triangles. Well, now that my 2 triangles are congruent, I know that all their corresponding parts are congruent. So then I can say that angle P is congruent to angle S because they are corresponding angles. They're in corresponding places. So then our reason for that statement would be corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or our CPCTC. Okay, a quick note, just know that this CPCTC reason should always be said after you have two triangles congruent. You'll never use CPCTC unless you already know that two triangles are congruent. Okay, so there's one, and notice it just went one step further than what we did before. Let's try one more. Okay, so this time, same setup again, or same start. Notice that in our picture, we can see two triangles there, right? So that's kind of our first hint that I'm probably going to want to prove my two triangles congruent. Also, we're in the unit where we're talking about proving triangles congruent, so that's probably a good start. Okay, so our givens, C is the midpoint of AD, and also C is the midpoint of BE, and those are given. Okay, so this time I'm trying to prove that two lines are parallel. So again, we've got to somehow get there, and I know that I can say two lines are parallel if, say, like corresponding angles are congruent, or if alternate interior angles are congruent. So I'm probably looking for some congruent angles. Well, if I have congruent triangles, then I can match up corresponding parts to get congruent angles, and maybe those can then get me my parallel lines. So I'm going to start this just like before with proving my two triangles congruent first. Okay, so I'm going to mark up my picture. We know C is the midpoint here of two different segments, so I can split those into congruent parts. So if C is the midpoint of AD, then I know AC and CD are congruent. And if C is the midpoint of BE, then I know BC and CE are congruent. So I've got two parts there, I have two sides, and the other thing I can see from my picture is I've got that X, or that bow tie shape, so I would also know that my vertical angles here in the middle are congruent. And then I can see the side angle side on both of those triangles, so I'm going to use side angle side to show my triangles congruent. Okay, so then let's write down our statements here. All we have here so far are our midpoints. So the first thing we marked were those congruent segments from the midpoints. So I'm going to write those down. So we said AC is congruent to CD, and also BC is congruent to CE. And I'm going to put those on the same number because they're going to have the same reason. And both of those came from the fact that there was a midpoint. So our reason here is the definition of midpoint. Okay, so there we've got a side and another side. So we've got our two sides done. Now I need an angle, and we said that came from our vertical angles. So then I can say that angle BCA is congruent to angle DCE. And our reason there, remember you want to use the theorem, not the definition, is that vertical angles are congruent. Okay, so there's our angle. Now we've got our three parts. So we can say that our two triangles are congruent. And again, we're going to pay attention and make sure we match up corresponding parts. So if I do triangle ABC, then that has to match up. So from A to B, there's no mark on that line. And then from B to C, there's two marks. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. I want to go along the no mark line, and then I'm going to go along the 2 mark line. So I'd have to match it up with triangle D, and then to E, and then to C. Okay, so match up the corresponding parts there. And our reason there for the triangles be congruent is side angle side. Okay, so first part is done. We now know that our two triangles are congruent. But remember, we're trying to prove that these two lines are parallel. So let's take a look at where those lines are. So to kind of highlight those, I've got line A here, or AD, sorry, and then line ED. Those are the two I want to prove parallel. So I need to pick then a transversal. So let's say I choose BE as my transversal. Well, once I have that drawn in, now I can see that I've got some alternate interior angles in my picture, right? Angle B up here and angle E, those are alternate interior angles for those parallel lines. So, or for those lines. If I can show that B and E are congruent, then that would mean that those green lines have to be parallel. And it just so happens that since we've shown that our triangles are congruent, B and E, those are my middle letters here, those are corresponding parts in my triangle. So then that means that I can say angle B has to be congruent to angle E. And our reason would be that they are corresponding parts in congruent triangles. So they're congruent, or CPCTC. Now that I know those two angles are congruent, I can now say that line AB is parallel to line DE. And my reason, if you remember this back from a couple units ago, is that if I know alternate interior angles are congruent, then that means that I have parallel lines. Ta-da! Okay, so that time we proved our triangles congruent. We had 2 extra steps to do our proof, but we did have to use that CPCTC to get us there. So on these proofs, you're going to see a lot of that where you've got to prove the triangle's congruent, and then you're going to use the CPCTC to show whatever else you need to get somewhere else in your proof. There's one more proof on these notes, but I'm going to save that for next week sometime so we can do another one together after the weekend. These 2 should be enough to kind of help you get through parts of your homework today. Your homework's on a worksheet today, and it's all proofs. Yay! As always, the answers are posted in OneNote, but please, please, please make sure you're trying them on your own first. And if that doesn't make sense, then look at the answers. Make sure you can figure out why the answer is what it is, or maybe even you cover up the reasons and you just look at the statements and you try to put those down and then try to come up with the reasons on your own. But you really have to try to practice these, get them wrong, and then figure out why they're wrong and why they should be what they are. If you're still stuck, come ask me a question, send me a message in Google Chat, but you've got to kind of talk about them and figure it out. Otherwise, you won't get better at these. Okay, so take some time with them, try them out. We'll go over lots of questions next week on proofs. We will also take a second quiz next week, and guess what? It'll be a proof, so you get to try one on your own. That way you'll have some feedback before we do the test, which is, again, before we go on Thanksgiving break. Okay? All right, have a great weekend, guys. I will see you next weekend, or next week.